Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. SEER is a member organization whose mission is to foster the success of a diverse community of environmental, energy, and resources lawyers, advisors, law students, and decision makers, and provide a premier forum for the exchange of ideas and information.
This is the Look Back at 50 Years of EPA, a limited podcast series where we interview practitioners in the development of environmental law and EPA.
I'm here today with Chuck Elkins, who founded the EPA Alumni Association in 2008 and has been its executive director ever since. Chuck, I believe your history with the EPA goes way back, right?
Well, I guess it does. When I came out of Yale Law School, I went to work directly for the Office of Management and Budget to start with. That was in '67. And I ended up, luckily, being in charge of the environmental budgets of many of the programs, air pollution, pesticides, et cetera. And after doing that for several years, I got assigned over temporarily to what was called the Ash Council, which was a group working for President Nixon that was creating a reorganization that would result in the Environmental Protection Agency. I ended up as the deputy to somebody that many of us know, Doug Costel, who later became administrator of the agency. So I was his deputy, and we worked through and wrote what's called Reorganization Plan Number 3, which created the agency, and then went over to become a special assistant to Bill Ruckelshaus, who was the first administrator. And I stayed there for 25 years, did 10 different management jobs, acting assistant administrator three different times, senior management in air, pesticides, toxics, noise, radiation, stratospheric ozone, acid rain. I did the whole field. Ended up with being the associate general counsel, and then left to become like many other people, an environmental consultant. Did that for 20 years, and then created the EPA Alumni Association. So I've kept my connection to EPA for a long time. A common theme of all that work, though, as I've thought back on it, is making regulatory decisions in the face of incomplete science and data. And this was particularly difficult for me in a way because my last science course in college was in freshman year. And so I can tell you, EPA, I learned an awful lot of science.
That it sounds like maybe the case for many lawyers who started in environmental practice, so learning a lot of science on the job. And I'm sure, you kind of just went through all of the different areas that you had your hands in it. So you probably had a full plate. Could you kind of give us some examples of tough decisions and challenges you faced in the early years at EPA?
Well, maybe the best example to start with is the asbestos ban. I was working in the Office of Toxic Substances, and the office, when I got there, was already working on an assignment to ban the products that had asbestos in it. It was sort of a typical case, but tough case in the sense that in one hand, it was easy. We thought we knew that asbestos was a pretty bad chemical, although there was still a lot of debate from the industry about exactly how bad. But the issue then was, how do we prevent people from getting exposed, and how much really is the risk that these people are exposed to? So for instance, it was used in brake linings, to allow cars to stop quickly. Well, where was the exposure to the asbestos? In one sense, it was all over the roadways because, of course, the little tiny particles of asbestos broke off as the brakes worked. But how much did people really get exposed to that? Well, it wasn't really clear. But then we worried about the workers who actually changed brakes. And those were both, of course, professional people who did it in shops, but also a lot of people did that at home. But the argument was, well, why don't we just tell them to be careful? So we had all these kind of debates. And an alternative was, for instance, the liners and missiles. And we figured that telling NASA that they couldn't shoot off any more missiles or rockets because we were taking the asbestos away, that didn't seem to make too much sense. So we looked at substitutes. How much did they cost? Did they work? For instance, did the non-asbestos brakes really work? And we consulted with NHTSA and Department of Transportation about that. And we looked at the health effects of these substitutes, because you didn't want to take one thing out of the market and put something back in that's just as dangerous. And then we looked at the overall costs. And so a lot of people think that making these regulatory decisions is you basically, ask the scientists, okay, what's the risk? And they tell you, that's a pretty bad stuff. And then we regulators would just say, okay, take it out, take it off the market. Well, no, it's a lot tougher than that. And you always end up saying, if I just knew some more, I think I'd be able to make a better decision.
That sounds particularly familiar in the days of COVID-19 and worrying about how harmful is this virus and what do we do and how do we take adequate precaution to prevent its spread. Do you kind of see the same themes from your early days?
Yeah, now you mentioned it, I think there is a lot of similarity. Maybe the difference is that at least on asbestos and things like that, we were sitting around the table, so to speak, at EPA, trying to look through the data and make these decisions and make them on a national basis. But here on the COVID thing, I think almost all of us have become risk managers, mayors, governors, parents, business managers, every one of them looking at sort of the same kind of issues we looked on asbestos. Okay, how bad is it? How do we prevent the exposure? What about the consequences of, if everybody went and sat in the closet, we would all be safe, but of course that doesn't work. And so I think I just can imagine, let's say a school superintendent, sitting there with his staff saying, don't you have any more data to help me make this decision? Can I get these kids back to school and do it safely? And by the way, how much would it cost to put plexiglass in every one of our schools? Oh, well, you don't know the answer to that? This is the tough answer. So I think another thing that's come out of, now that I think about COVID, is that I think citizens have realized that epidemiology, the way in which we look at how bad these chemicals, or in this case a virus, are in the human population, it's hard to do that kind of science. You can't just test people by saying, here, why don't we expose you and see how it works, same as a chemical. We found out that epidemiology is a very inact science, and I think we're all frustrated that the scientists can't tell us more about this COVID, because if they could, we could go back to school and back to business with a lot more confidence.
And that kind of brings up another good point, is since it's an inexact science and you're kind of doing your best to safeguard as many people as possible, but still allow for a little bit of wiggle room, sometimes it helps if you have a little more direct guidance on what to do. So taking it back into the environmental context, in cases like with asbestos, would it have helped in the regulatory decision-making process if you had more explicit instructions in the law that maybe Congress had passed?
Well, for instance, they could have told us, take the asbestos out of brake linings and out of asbestos cement pipe and all these places where asbestos shingles, et cetera. They could have done that. I think they would have faced some of the same kind of questions we were facing about what are the consequences of that, and it doesn't work. Now, they did do that in the case of PCBs in the Toxic Substance Control Act, which we were using to try to deal with asbestos. They had already decided to take PCBs out of the environment, and they basically said to EPA, okay, take it out and you figure out how to get it done. But it was a lot simpler. You weren't fighting the issue of whether to do it or not. You were just trying to work through the practicality. So that, I think, is a good example where Congress was able to make a decision. And I think the law worked pretty well. Another example, though, that I don't think worked nearly as well was the so-called Delaney Clause. This is a problem the agency faced, particularly in the early days. Congressman Delaney had decided that if a pesticide was found to be a carcinogen, under some sort of circumstances, that meant that the pesticide level had to be set at 0. No questions asked, no flexibility. That's the answer. It's 0. And working in the pesticide area early on in my career at EPA, that was often sort of the too blunt an instrument. It really didn't take into account exposure, what the benefit was of having that particular pesticide for a particular crop. These are trade-offs which really were excluded by that clause. And so early in the time of the agency, the AIR program was faced with what to do about a particular carcinogen. This was vinyl chloride, and should they wanted to set a standard for that, and should it be 0? And the staff was very much, following the Delaney clause approach. Well, it should be 0. And at that point, Charlie Gregg, who was a Harvard lawyer, and I heard about this. We've been struggling with uranium radon and issues of how much radon people should be exposed to, and 0 was not an option. And we figured, and we've been working in the Delaney clause issue. So he and I jumped into this issue with both feet and made a big fuss about it. And with some help from others, of course, convinced the AIR program that the number should not be 0. But of course, once you decide it shouldn't be 0, you're back into the asbestos kind of issue. If it's not 0, then what is it? What should it be? And as all of those who follow the history of EPA, a lot of the effort at EPA, beginning there in the early 70s, was to figure out how to do a risk assessment of a chemical and to decide how much was enough and how much risk we should allow the American public to be exposed to. So it was something I started off on early in the agency and have never escaped.
So it sounds like back in the 70s, EPA was sort of getting its feet wet in a lot of different areas and feeling its way along about how best to regulate and how best to come up with standards. So could you tell us or give us some examples of what it was like to be involved in that decision-making process, and maybe describe how these decisions eventually got made in the early days at EPA?
Sure, I've got a couple of examples. And remember, the asbestos case I was started off with today was done really in the 80s. And by that time, we thought we were pretty darn sophisticated about what we were doing. In the early 70s, it was more that we were winging it. One case I remember was that about 20 cattle got exposed to a pesticide by eating feed that was contaminated with that. And my boss, who's the assistant administrator for hazardous materials control, David Dominic, was confronted with the question of what we should do about these cattle. And he turned to the staff and said, what is a safe level of this pesticide in these cattle? And I'll just set that as the number. So of course we worked away with it, looking at the imperfect science, and we came up with a number. He declared that these cattle could not be consumed because they needed to meet a level of X, and they were at triple X or whatever. He later left the agency and went into private law practice, and the policy office at EPA decided, I don't know where they came up with this idea, but they decided to ask him to come back for a week or two and look to see what happened to these cattle. And so he made a number of phone calls and came up with the startling answer that these farmers were no dummies. And they decided, well, if there was too much pesticide in these cattle, all we needed to do was to fatten them up, and we'd get this concentration of this chemical down to an acceptable level. And lo and behold, that's what they did. And they sold every one of them back into the marketplace, and we ate them. I guess somebody ate them. And well, if it met the number, I guess it was perfectly safe. But that sort of illustrated to me early on that we didn't really know what we were doing in many of these cases. We were doing the best we could, trying to make scientifically sound decisions, but there was so much that we didn't know about.
It sounds like a lot of trial by fire in some instances, and really learning as you go. But hopefully, there are some takeaways from that. Did you learn anything from the experience with the cattle that helped you on maybe a next case or something else down the line?
Well, I certainly had it in mind on maybe the biggest case in my career, certainly the scariest case. This is a case where 20 million chickens in Mississippi had been same thing. They had eaten food which was contaminated with a pesticide. In this case, I think it was Aldrin Dieldrin. By that time, David Dominic had left, and I was the acting assistant administrator for hazardous materials control. So it came to me instead of somebody else to figure this thing out. And the state of Mississippi was waiting for us to make a decision about these chickens. And what was particularly difficult for me, I was so used to, coming up with a recommendation and handing it to a political appointee, and they're the ones who got to make the decision instead of us civil servants. I mean, we did the hard staff work as best we could, but somebody else had to stand up there and take the heat. And in this case, the administrator and the deputy administrator, who were the only two people on the organization chart above me, were recused from doing anything about Aldrin Dieldrin because of an ongoing lawsuit or case where they couldn't say anything about it. So I couldn't even talk to them about it. And so there I am stuck. So of course you can guess what I did. I said to my staff, we'll find out what a safe level of Aldrin Dieldrin is in chicken, and we'll just tell people if the chickens, sample out to be at this level, then everybody can eat them. So they worked away on that number, and I was still not quite sure about what to do. And I had set myself on a target that it was Friday afternoon. I said, I'm just going to make a decision. I'm going to make it on Monday morning. I'm going to just take the data I've got, and I'm going to make the decision because nobody else is going to make it for me. And so here comes this phone call out of the blue. It was this farmer in Mississippi. And he says, Mr. Elkins, I understand you're making a decision about this. And when are you going to make this decision? And I said, well, I'm going to think about it over the weekend. And I'm going to make a decision on Monday. And he says, don't do that, please. He says, these chickens that I've got are costing me $50,000 a day to feed. So you're going to have me feed them on Saturday. You're going to have me feed them on Sunday. And then on Monday, you're going to tell me I have to kill them. That's ridiculous. You should make the decision today and save me this money. Secondly, are you going to be telling us that these chickens are okay if they have a certain level of this pesticide in them, that they're perfectly fine to eat? And I said, well, yeah, that's sort of what we're thinking about doing. He says, look, the state of Mississippi is trying to become the supplier of chickens to McDonald's. We're new in this industry. We're trying to really break into the market, and we have targeted McDonald's as our thing. And I'll be darned if we want to be known as the state where we grow cancer-causing chickens. Either these chickens are safe or they're not safe. And you ought to, if you don't think they're completely safe, then you should make that decision. Well, he hung up. And that sort of added to my staff work. And I
just a little bit.
I think this guy has brought a perspective that I didn't get from my staff, or that I didn't bring to it either. And so I made the decision that afternoon to kill 20 million chickens in Mississippi, despite the fact that this was really hurting a young industry in Mississippi. So an hour later, having announced that, Senator Stennis from Mississippi calls me up and says, Mr. Elkins, I refrained from calling you because I didn't want to interfere in this decision, but you decided now to kill 20 million chickens in my state. And look, we're going to have to bury these chickens once we kill them. I mean, we got to do something with them, and we're going to have to bury them. And I'll be darned if we want you to come down here a month or two from now and tell us that we buried these chickens, we buried them incorrectly. And we've got to dig them all up and do it again. So here's what I want you to do. It's Friday afternoon. I want you to have your staff in the governor's office at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. And I want you to tell us how you want us to bury these chickens. And that's the way we're going to do it. So I hung up and I said, I think he's right too. And it so happened that since my office had everything except the air and water program in it, it was all the little programs. We had the solid waste program there too. So I called up Arson Darnay, who was the director of that program. And I said, look, I don't have time to tell you much about this. I just want you to get on the airplane and go to Atlanta. When you get there, give me a ring. So he gets to Atlanta. By that time, the press and all that are not all over me again. So he gets to Atlanta, calls me. I said, look, I want you in the governor's office at 9 o'clock. And I want you to make sure this gets done correctly. And sure enough, he shows up at 9 o'clock Monday morning. I don't know what he told the governor, but anyway, the next few weeks, they killed those chickens and buried them. And without going into detail, burying chickens is difficult because they bloat up and they sometimes come back up. So I'm happy to report that only a few chickens came back up, and I had a big success.
Well, between the cattle and a few zombie chickens, it sounds like, you may have quite an extensive background with keeping farmers safe. But also, I'm sure they're terrified of you going back to EPA and having to make some difficult choices regarding livestock. So thanks for those stories about early decision making in the agency. As you know, this is the 50th anniversary of the creation of the EPA, and so we thought it would be interesting to gather some stories about what life was like in the early days. And I really appreciate you taking some time to tell us about these early decision-making processes. So with that in mind, it's hard for many of us to imagine what the atmosphere was like that brought about the creation of the agency itself. You were there and played a part, if I remember our conversations correctly. Do you remember what that was like?
Well, it was in 1970 when the agency was created, and contrary to what I think maybe the common thought might be that, well, there was Earth Day and then EPA was just created. Well, it wasn't quite that simple at all. It was a long time in coming that we had environmental programs back in the 60s, and in fact, that's what I was the budget examiner for at OMB. And but those programs were fairly weak, and the environmental movement, as we now know it now, really didn't exist. The people that we interacted with were primarily hunters and fishermen who really wanted to make sure that whatever we did in the environment, we left places for them to hunt and fish in. I'm overstating it. It wasn't, I mean, there were other people who cared about the environment, but they were not strong advocates. But a number of things happened building up to that I think people have heard about or can remember. One is Rachel Carson wrote a book that basically showed that birds, particularly the bald eagles, were in danger of becoming extinct because of DDT. That was a wake-up call in the chemical area. And then off the coast of Santa Barbara, we had a oil well blowout. And that's a beautiful area off the state of California. And people really, really got upset about that. The Cuyahoga River caught on fire, not for the first time, for the 13th time. And that was the one that got written up in Time magazine. And that really, I mean, nobody knew that, most of us didn't know that rivers actually caught on fire. They were so polluted. In Pittsburgh, it was so polluted from the steel plants there that people would have to take a second white shirt to work because by noon it had turned black and you needed to do, if you were in an office job, you needed to switch your shirt. Los Angeles, of course, we're all familiar with the smog that was people beginning to realize this is more than just an irritant, it's actually a health issue. So there are a lot of bad things happening and people began to say, that's enough. We need to do more. And Nixon was the president there in 1970, and he was looking for ways to make the government more efficient. So he appointed Roy Ash to run this organization to look at reorganizations. And he first came up with the idea of a Department of Natural Resources. That was too controversial. The president wasn't going to get that through. So they narrowed it down to EPA. So he was worried that Senator Muskie, who was thinking, who might be sort of a competitor to him, was getting very involved in the environment. So the president decided he ought to do something on the environment big. So he had his first environmental message back in February and started drafting a new Clean Air Act. Earth Day happened that April. And from then on, it's history. I mean, allegedly, 1 out of 20 people, every 20 people will participate in some kind of teach-in across the country. And so we drafted reorganization plan number 3, put it through to the Congress. They had to vote it up or down. They couldn't find a way to vote it down, and so given the situation, and so it went forward. People might be interested in just a couple of things about writing that reorganization. Remember, this is not creating the agency out of whole cloth. This is pulling pieces out of other agencies and sticking them together with Scotch tape and trying to make an agency. And one of the areas that was particularly difficult was the radiation area, because the Atomic Energy Commission was a big deal back then. We were in the Cold War, and they ran a lot of things. And they said, you know, it's one thing to say, well, you're going to take the Clean Air Act out of HEW and move it over to this new agency. You just move the whole act over there. But from a legal point of view, you can't do that. There's nothing in our act that says anything about setting environmental standards around power plants and around our nuclear facilities. That's just something that, you know, came naturally to us. It's not written down anywhere. We just have a staff that writes those numbers. And I said, well, the president's already decided that this new agency is going to set environmental levels around nuclear power plants. So what are we going to do? And they said, well, go back and tell the president you can't do it. And I said, nope, we're not going to do that. So I pulled out what I wrote into the reorganization plan. I thought many of your listeners are lawyers and they might appreciate how we were winging it back in 1970 as well. So I couldn't say, move this over from the Atomic Energy Act. So instead I said, the functions of the Atomic Energy Commission under the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 as amended, administered through its Division of Radiation Protection Standards, to the extent that such functions of the Commission consist of establishing generally applicable environmental standards for the protection of the general environment from radioactive material. So basically all I said was, whatever is under the statute that allows the Division of Radiation Standards to produce these standards today, we want that. We moved it to EPA. And I'll finish up with this. The ironic thing was that a couple of years later, when I was acting as system administrator for air, or several years later, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which essentially took over the functions of the Atomic Energy Commission, really hated the fact that EPA had this authority. And they went over to the White House and said, you know, those crazy people over in 1970 really did something really stupid. They took this authority away from us and we want it back. And so the White House holds a meeting, and guess who gets invited? It's me. And so I go over and I said, hey, you guys, we all know each other. We knew each other back in 1970. You guys agreed to this. You knew perfectly well what you were doing, and it shouldn't change. And they were not exactly happy campers. I think maybe they did get back a little bit of authority, but basically we shut them up. So, I have other stories about how we chose people like a baseball team or whatever, but I don't know whether you want to hear
Oh,
these.
now, yeah, you've touched on a soft spot. I think, you know, if you're bringing America's pastime in it and tying that into environmental law, then we've got to have some further explanation here.
It had to do with radiation again. The radiation program in HEW handled not only environmental radiation, but also radiation from things like microwave ovens and this sort of thing. And we in the Ash Council said, we don't want the microwave oven stuff. We don't want to get into consumer products. We're trying to be an environmental agency. So the problem was we only got to have half the office. So how do you get half the office? Well, it turned out that the director wanted to stay back in HEW. And the deputy director of the office was younger, and he wanted to come to the new agency. So they gathered the whole staff in the conference room, and they chose up like a sandlot baseball team. The director would choose one person, the deputy would choose somebody, and they went back and forth until they went through the whole staff. And the story was that they did the same thing to the lab equipment, and that each office ended up with half of an electron microscope or whatever. At least you ended up with more or less people who were happy coming to EPA, and the people wanted to stay back in HEW. Creating the agency was really moving these little pieces over. Some of the agencies sent us some of their troublemakers. I tried to prevent that, but wasn't able to entirely. And one other guy who worked way up in HEW had been working on environmental stuff. And I called him up and I said, I won't say his name, but so-and-so, I'm writing your name into this reorganization plan. And he was a GS-15. He said, well, wait a minute, yeah, what am I going to be doing? I said, I'm not telling you. I have no idea what you're going to be doing, but you're coming. And it turned out to be, he was a great employee. And in fact, he and I worked on a bunch of projects. And I was so glad that I was arbitrary and capricious and just brought him over.
I think maybe it's good that the horse trading, or just choosing up sides one versus the other, maybe that tradition was a one-time thing and doesn't carry on going forward. I'm sure it would be a little distressing to wake up on a Monday morning and have news break across the wire that you've been traded to a separate agency. Do you have any other stories about maybe early enforcement actions?
Yeah, EPA opened its doors on December 2nd, 1970, and Bill Ruckelshaus, who'd come from the Department of Justice, was the first administrator. He had worked in enforcement environmental things in the state of Indiana. And one of the things he determined coming into that job is he needed to show that things were different, and that this agency was really an agency to be listened to and reckoned with. So 8 days after he was in office, he went down to the annual Congress of the Cities in Atlanta. This is all the mayors. I copied down some words of his. I'll read what he said. And you can imagine the mayors sitting there in that auditorium. The responsibilities which are entrusted to this new agency, I must meet head on today. A gross pollution problem exists in Atlanta, Georgia, and clearly something must be done about it. The Chattahoochee River flows clear and clean above Atlanta, but when it reaches this great city, 32 million gallons of untreated effluents are dumped into it daily, along with another 40 million gallons of only primary treatment. Beneath the city of Atlanta, the Chattahoochee River, an interstate stream, flows into Alabama. It is a virtual open sewer. So he declared that Atlanta had to fix this problem, and other cities like that. And the response back from the mayors was, well, wait, you're supposed to give us money, and then we fix this problem. And he said, nothing doing. The grant is a nice thing to have, but the law says you're supposed to do it. And that decision stuck, and it affected a lot of cities. It wasn't just Atlanta. I thought he was pretty brave doing it right there in Atlanta. But the next week, he went after the Jones and Lawton Steel Corporation, and they were dumping cyanide in the Cuyahoga River. That's the one that caught fire, but it didn't catch fire because of the cyanide, but we didn't want the cyanide there. And a new Department of Justice section was set up to deal with environmental laws, which of course all of us are familiar with now, and has made a tremendous difference in the way in which litigation has gone forward in the environmental area. And they took on a number of water pollution cases, et cetera. And then the last thing I remember happening that first year, and I'll just finish up with this, is that there was an inversion over the city of Birmingham, Alabama, became a public health emergency. And the administrator ordered the shutdown of all the major industries in the city. So basically, Ruckelshaus showed there's a new sheriff in town, and it really made a difference. And I think this continued, of course, as the years went by, and I think industry decided that they needed to take a different look at this. Cities, which have been polluting, did the same, and he was right to do that. And I think it shows, if I may say this, the advantage of having a lawyer as the head of the agency.
I definitely won't disagree with you there, maybe biased a little bit, but that actually raises a good point and maybe can segue into another part of this conversation is sort of the agency's relationships with stakeholders. You've kind of showed how at the very beginning, 8 days after the agency opens, the administrator is willing to interact with the mayors of the cities that are gathered in Atlanta. And can you tell us a little bit more about the relationship between EPA and stakeholders, not just regulated industries, but also environmental groups in those early days, and maybe how that relationship changed over your time at EPA?
Sure. The agency's relationship with everyone had to be sort of established anew. Let me first, before I get to the environmentalists, just mention other agencies, because sort of to follow on what I said earlier about the fact that we pulled these functions out of other agencies, and the president's interest in particular was taking away functions from agencies that we thought were sort of a conflict of interest for them. Pesticides out of agriculture, environmental levels of radiation around nuclear power plants, regulation of automobiles that normally the transportation department would be concerned about. So Bill Riley, who was an administrator of the agency later on in the agency, tells a story about going to a cabinet meeting, and one of the other cabinet members said, "You know, this EPA is just a horrible place. They're in our knickers. They're they're interfering with our work." And so one of the big consequences of our relationship with other agencies was the creation of what began to be called the quality of life review. Had other names as we went forward, but the Office of Management and Budget essentially would ride herd on things we were doing, and sitting at the table with these other agencies. So it sort of brought about a rebalancing of the relationship a little bit. And I think that's continued today. In the case of the environmentalists, you can imagine at first they were just elated to have us, and particularly watching Ruckelshaus and those of that early time. And one of the ways we used to make decisions, which I thought was really great, was we would have a controversy, and we would hold a meeting. We would invite the industry to come in, invite the environmentalists to come in, sit on the other side of the table. We'd sit at the front, at the top of the head of the table. We would say, "Okay, tell us about this issue," and they would go after it just as if we were in the court. Each side arguing their side, and we'd sit there and look wise, and they'd go home, and we'd make a decision. And of course, we were doing a lot of staff work ourselves. Don't get me wrong, but it helped to have these parties argue the case there in front of us. So that went well until I think it was sort of by the time we got to the Reagan administration, the environmentalists said, "We're not coming back anymore. We're not going to participate in this decision making." And I remember going off to a meeting at Yale Law School about the environment as one of these big conferences, and I complained that these environmentalist groups, we were sitting around the table, weren't coming anymore. And they said, "But Chuck, can't we just count on you to make the right decision?" And I said, "Well, you don't understand what it's like to be a regulator. If you have to both do the staff meeting, all the staff work, and then pretend as if you're the environmentalist and take on the industry, it puts you in a very difficult situation. And quite frankly, I think that's sort of the situation the agency has been in for many, many years, and I think has been handicapped. One other experience I just mentioned is that early on, I mean, I was really happy working with the environmentalists, and I remember that this guy from the Audubon Society was all over me about, when are you going to cancel the first pesticide after DDT? Of course, we did DDT, but then what about Aldrin-Deal and these others? And when we finally were able to make the decision to take the pesticide off the market, he was the first person I called. I said, guess what? We just took so-and-so off the market. And there was a pause, and he said, Chuck, what about all the rest? At that point, I said to myself, I think the honeymoon is over. We are a regulatory agency. We're not the environmental advocate agency. We'll take these pesticides off the market when we have the case. And until we have the case, we can't do it and shouldn't do it, and we won't do it. So things changed as the agency grew.
That's actually kind of a good point maybe to close with. It's interesting to see the circle of going from your early decisions, and especially talking about the asbestos example that we kind of led off with, and winging it, right? Maybe just making decisions not on the fly, but as best you could with limited information. And then as time progressed, you get to the point that you're sort of describing, where you have two passionate sides bringing to light all the information that potentially is relevant to making the decision. And you get these two sides not only bringing you, but advocating that this should be more persuasive than this. And out of this full-fleshed argument, discussion, and development of the issues, you're able to sit there at the head of the table, not just act-wise, but hopefully account for every issue that's been raised, address them, and then move on to the next pressing task. So it's cool to see that EPA grew from where it started and progressed down the line. And maybe there are some lessons to be learned from the past and previous issues that the agency's been tasked with addressing. And maybe those lessons can be carried forward as we move into the next 50 years of life at EPA. Do you have any other last minute stories or comments to throw in?
I would just agree with you about that. I think that the agency here is 50 years old this year. Its job isn't done. In fact, many of the challenges are even tougher than the ones we faced early on. They're not so black and white. The one thing that I think we all learned through the years is that they're challenging. You need to do the staff work. You really do depend on people outside the agency to help you figure out what the facts are, to advocate, but to bring data. And even though it sort of is, you worry about getting a stomach ulcer from working there, from the tension, the thing that really made it worthwhile, and I think is still true today at EPA, is that the people in the agency are really top notch. They care about the quality of the work they're doing, and they base the decisions on data. You couldn't really ask for much more than that. So whether you're working in the agency or outside the agency, you have something to contribute to that decision making. And I would just urge that it be based on good science and data, because quite frankly, that's what the professional staff in the agency is looking for. And if you've got something good to bring to the table, they want to hear it.
Well, hopefully recounting the stories and experiences from your early days and long career at EPA haven't brought you too much stress or potential ulcers. I know that you getting back into the feeling of some of these things can bring up old emotions. So hopefully it's been a nice and easy conversation, talking about great folks and great work. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on this podcast. It's wonderful to hear these stories. I can't say enough about the great work that you did in preparing for this interview and agreeing to share a little bit of your experience so that we can get it on record and have a copy going forward to learn and to continue to grow and to adjust. And, hopefully in the next 50 years when they're doing there probably won't be podcasts anymore. Who are we kidding? But as they're doing a summary of how environmental law and EPA has changed, maybe folks can look back on this and that Chuck Elkins, he was really on to something. We had something good, and we carried it forward for the next 50 years. So thanks again, Chuck, for your time. Really appreciate you sitting down and chatting with us today. In closing, the history of environmental law has been long, and the nation has seen 50 years of formal effort on these topics following the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency. As Chuck noted in the talk today, the work of the people who made environmental laws and made the EPA what it is today are the stories that will inspire the work of the next 50 years. Chuck has shared his story about his role. What story will you tell in the future?
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at www.americanbar.org/enviro. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.